So you created the hyperbolic tapering.
It offers this very much more slower, careful, long-term tapering with enough support so that people are not ripped off these drugs.
You lived through withdrawal yourself. Can you take us back when you realized that traditional tapering guidance wasn't working?
I guess the turning point was on how antidepressants work.
If you love diving into the latest wellness secrets on the podcast, then you're going to want to join my exclusive weekly newsletter. Get insider wellness tips you won't hear anywhere else. Be the first to know about my upcoming fasting workshops because let's be real, fasting is the secret weapon for surviving perimenopause. Access my weekly essentials, tools, and biohacks to help you thrive in midlife. I promise to make it worth your while, straight to the point, no fluff, just powerful tips to help you feel your best every single week. Don't miss out. Sign up now at thewelldrop.com. Let's take your wellness to the next level together. Welcome back to The Well Drop, where we turn wellness overwhelm into little drops of wisdom you can actually use. I'm your host, Amber Berger, and if you're a high-performing woman trying to do all the things without losing your mind, you're in the right place. Here's a sobering fact. Approximately 1 in 3 perimenopausal women who see their GP with low mood are prescribed antidepressants, often without considering hormonal causes or alternatives. And for decades, women have been put on these medications without ever being given a clear, safe path to get off them until now. Today's guest is someone who's lived the science, felt the struggle, and changed the game in mental health care. Dr. Mark Horowitz, the co-founder of Outro. He was prescribed an antidepressant while in medical school, right as he was earning his PhD in neurobiology of depression and the pharmacology of antidepressants. Years later, as a training psychiatrist in the UK, he tried to come off his medication the traditional way, and he was blindsided by panic attacks, sleep disruption, and a depression worse than anything he'd experienced before. Searching for answers, Mark pioneered hyperbolic tapering, an evidence-based method now endorsed by national authorities in the UK, and he is the co-founder of Outro, a telehealth clinic for safe, science-backed tapering support. In 2024, he also published the first textbook dedicated to neurobiology-based strategies for safely stopping psychotropic medications. Today, we're talking about why traditional withdrawal guidance often misses the mark and why too many women are stuck on medications they don't need, and how technology and genuine community can finally give them a real off-ramp. While genuine community can give them finally a real off-ramp. So grab your coffee or get your weighted vest on and go for a walk because let's drop in. Mark, Dr. Mark, please, thank you so much for being with us on The Well Drop today. It is truly an honor.
Thanks for having me on. It's a great idea actually to do a weighted vest walk. I should have got myself prepared. That's a good tip.
I love a weighted vest. I would be wearing one now. I'm walking. I know I need to get myself a walking treadmill so I can actually chat and get my steps in at the same time. You know, for most of people who may or may not know you, you have a real unique perspective. You studied antidepressants at the highest academic level. You were prescribed them as a psychiatrist, and you lived through withdrawal yourself. Can you take us back to that personal turning point when you realized that traditional tapering guidance wasn't working and that there was no real path for people to safely get off medication?
Yes. So I guess I've been on both sides of the desk, as it were, when it comes to antidepressants. I've prescribed them and I've had them prescribed for me. And I guess the turning point was at the end of my PhD, which was on how antidepressants work. I came across an article talking about withdrawal effects from antidepressants. It's about 10 years ago now. And I found that extremely startling because I had not heard about withdrawal effects from these drugs before. Maybe they were less well known 10 years ago. And it made me think two things. One, drugs that cause withdrawal effects wear off over time. That's tolerance. The more tolerant you are to a drug, the more you get withdrawal when you stop it. And at that point, I'd been on an antidepressant, Lexapro or escitalopram, for about 10 or 12 years. I thought, how could it still be having an effect after that long if it causes tolerance. That's point one. And point two was drugs that cause withdrawal are generally not that good for you. Drugs like benzodiazepines, Valium, Xanax, Klonopin are not so good for you in the long term. Or opioids like OxyContin are not so good for you in the long term. So it made me think, what is this drug doing in the long term? I had a number of health problems, a lot of problems with fatigue, with concentration and memory issues. And it had been suggested to me that it might be something to do with the antidepressant. And all of that made me think I better try to come off it.
It's interesting that they actually made the connection, though, that those symptoms could possibly be due to the medication. I feel like that's kind of unusual. Most people would
Yeah.
probably think of every other excuse in the book besides something
Yes.
they're taking every day. And
I-
have these medications been approved for long-term use? Like, was that the initial intention when they were actually created? Was it for short-term or for long-term use?
So both good points, Emma. So one, you're clever to pick up on me saying about the drugs causing tiredness and concentration problems. That wasn't from doctors. I sort of glossed over that. It was actually that I saw that other people in online peer support forums were talking about the same issues. They had also had huge fatigue, memory and concentration problems since using antidepressants, and that made a little light bulb go off in my mind. So you're quite correct. It wasn't suggested by doctors, and they rarely make that connection. Mostly because long-term effects are much harder to kind of spot than shorter-term effects.
Yeah.
So if you take an antibiotic and you feel nauseous the next day, it's pretty obvious what's going on. But if you take a drug that makes you feel 2% more tired every few months, after 10 years, that can really build up, but you may not work out it's the drug. And that happens a lot in my clinic. I sort of show people a list of the side effects of antidepressants and ask them, circle which ones you have.
Mm-hmm.
And they often say, I don't have any of these before they see the list. Then they see the list, and they often circle 15 side effects: weight gain, trouble concentrating, sexual problems, more mood instability. And they sort of look up and they go, I never thought that this was the drug. And it's hard to say definitely that it is, but it makes you think. When we come back to those people after they're off their drugs, often they've gone away, and that's much stronger evidence. And in answer to your question, a very good one, what were these drugs intended for? They were intended for short-term use. The trials that were initially conducted to show these drugs work go for 8 to 12 weeks.
Wow.
But there was a study. I mean, some people find that shocking. 90
no time. I mean,
96% exactly. Most studies go for less than 12 weeks. There was a study put out in America earlier this year that showed the average use of these drugs is 8 years. So in other words, studies go for 8 weeks and people are using them for 8 years. And so a lot of this is very, there's not good research behind long-term use. A lot of it really is well beyond what the researchers looked at carefully.
I mean, it's such a staggering statistic, and you're basically confirming what I'm seeing with my clients and even just with my own friends. Research shows that nearly half of women experience depression, anxiety, mood changes during perimenopause. And the number one solution they're often actually even given is an antidepressant. And it's funny that you're stating all those symptoms. They're so interrelated. It's almost like in midlife, you don't want to keep exacerbating them. So it sounds like I'm kind of answering my own question. The problem with that approach is that you're sort of doubling down almost on those type of symptoms by taking an antidepressant, especially in this midlife period.
It's possible. Maybe I'll just finish off briefly my answer to your first question about what happened when I came off my drug and why I sort of thought about the area of tapering, and then that's what you just asked. Sorry to jump around like that.
Oh, that's fine.
So, I decided to come off my antidepressant, and I sort of read about it. I read what my professors were saying about coming off the drugs. They said you can come off in a few weeks, which is kind of the advice given to most Americans around the world and people around the world. I thought I'd go a lot slower than that to be careful, and I came off over months, and I used small doses using liquids. I was very careful and obsessive. And when I came off the drug or got down to very low doses, my life kind of exploded. I had trouble sleeping, and I would wake up in the mornings with these sort of panic attacks, feeling like I was being chased by a wild animal. They would
Wow.
last for hours and hours of the day. It was more like terror than panic. And, I'd never felt like that before. When I went on the drugs in my early 20s, I was a confused, existentially troubled young man who wasn't very keen on my degree. When I came off the drugs, it was a completely different ballpark. It was the worst symptoms I've ever had in my entire life.
And you did
Um,
it slower than the recommended
I
tapering
did it.
too,
I did it
right?
many times slower than the recommended taper, and that still
Wow.
happened. And at first, I thought, "Oh, look, I'm a very unlucky person. I've got these terrible withdrawal effects." And then online, I found a dozen people with similar effects, and then I found hundreds, and eventually, I found tens of thousands of people. And I thought something is wrong. Everyone's having trouble coming off these drugs, but the guidelines say you can just halve the drug or quarter of the drug, and then just stop it in a few weeks. It can't. This is clearly not just me. Something is wrong. And the trick behind it, just very briefly, is I mentioned those 8 to 12 week studies. After those studies, they stopped the drugs in a couple of weeks, and they found that people had trouble, but not terrible trouble. And that's why guidelines say you can come off in 2 or 4 weeks, because it's based on short-term use. Now, in America, you talk about people being on the drugs for years or decades. Coming
Yes.
off in 2 or 4 weeks makes no sense. Sort of, to me, the analogy I use is it's like a car company crashing a car into a wall at 5 miles an hour and saying it's safe on impact, and ignoring the fact that people are driving around at 60 miles an hour on the highway. So, that's the difference between stopping after 8 weeks and 8 years.
If you love diving into the latest wellness secrets on the podcast, then you're going to want to join my exclusive weekly newsletter. Get insider wellness tips you won't hear anywhere else. Be the first to know about my upcoming fasting workshops because let's be real, fasting is the secret weapon for surviving perimenopause. Access my weekly essentials, tools, and biohacks to help you thrive in midlife. I promise to make it worth your while, straight to the point, no fluff, just powerful tips to help you feel your best every single week. Don't miss out. Sign up now at thewelldrop.com. Let's take your wellness to the next level together. And that makes sense that the guidelines would say a couple weeks, but it's probably because the medicine was first invented only to be used for a few months.
Exactly.
So then that would
Exactly.
be in line. But then how come, I mean, you studied this, like why, I mean, the doctors, I know they want to do right by their clients. How come when they put them on it, they're not ensuring that they're then getting them off it after a certain amount of time?
It's a great question. Exactly. Doctors, of course, are trying to do the right thing. It's because there's no training on it. Doctors are, nervous about it. My kind of gag is the first lecture that I heard on how to stop an antidepressant was one that I gave
Ugh,
because, it wasn't part of our curriculum. I was
really?
given hundreds of lectures on how to start drugs and almost none on how to stop them. It's because the studies are done by drug companies. Their interest is in starting the drugs, not in stopping them.
Of
That
course.
then that influences guidelines and medical school. And so
Yeah.
because there's very little information, doctors don't quite know what they're doing. When things go wrong, they get nervous and they think, I don't want to do this again for other patients. So they get gun shy because they're poorly informed about what's going on. And that's a very big hole, I think, in prescribing because, I sort of say it's a bit like if a car company didn't have brakes on its cars, suddenly there'd be a lot of trouble. But that's kind of happening with drugs. There's not good evidence on how to stop them. And so it's very easy to start them, but very, very hard to stop them. So there is a
I
real
think
imbalance
that's
there.
a great point that you bring up that, our goal is to really empower people to own their wellness. And I think that's a great message that people don't realize it's not even the doctor's fault. It's really in the
Yeah.
academic curriculum that they're just not taught it. But yet we're so quick to just write a script and give and provide the medicine without thinking of the other side of like, well, what about getting off it? Like, it's not normal to just be taking something every day for years. Like, the
Yes.
goal is to get better, right? And it's like you're going to
Yes.
therapy and you're talking, like, you should be making forward progress, which means
Yes.
if you need something to get you through a time, sure, okay. But then everyone, I think, just like settles into this routine. Like, we are creatures of habit. And so we just
Yes.
kind of set it and forget it, is
Actually,
basically what it sounds like.
there's even more than that going on, Amber, I think, because people are told this story about antidepressants that they fix a chemical imbalance in the brain. There's this idea that depressed people have low serotonin. You take the drug, it fixes it, and that's why you might want to keep taking it long term. People are even told it's sort of like insulin for diabetes. That's something that I hear a lot of people say. And I guess we know now that story is not true. That's sort of a marketing line that was very successful from drug companies. And if you're told that, it makes sense why you wouldn't want to stop it. If I was told I don't make enough insulin, here's some insulin, of course I'm going to take it. And so that story is very convincing, but also not based in science. We've done some research in the last few years that showed that healthy, normal volunteers and depressed people don't show differences in their serotonin levels. And so it's not true to say that antidepressants fix a chemical imbalance like insulin in diabetes. And we know that people that believe that are more likely to stay on their drugs long term and not try to stop them. So I think it's important that people, and women especially, understand that is not, an evidence-based, science-backed idea.
Yeah, are there any sort of top of mind questions or research that a person should do when they are prescribed a medication for their doctor before taking it? Like, where should somebody's first steps go?
Right. I mean, I guess there's, to me, talk about antidepressants in particular, but it might relate to other drugs. There's 5 important questions that you need to know about a drug before you take it. One is, how effective is it? 2, what are the likely side effects? 3, how does it work? 4, what are the alternatives? And 5, how will I stop it? And, until you can answer those questions, you're not really informed. And I'll go through them briefly when it comes to antidepressants. Antidepressants show an improvement over placebo of 2 points on a 52-point depression scale. It's a very, very small difference.
That's it.
All sorts of, people think, these, sort of exactly when people say, you must be misrepresenting it. The biggest supporters of these drugs look at the same studies.
Wow.
It's a very, very small effect. Some people argue that actually that effect is even exaggerated by the way the drug companies do the studies. It could be even smaller, but everyone agrees, it is not a large effect. Number 2, there's a lot of side effects. I won't go through them all now. It'll sound like a drug company advertisement at the end when they talk through them very quickly in America. But, those things are,
real.
They're real.
That's what I look at. Like, I'm always like, go read the fine print that's like hiding in the back in the dark corner of the room. And if you're comfortable with that, then okay. But like, I'm sure most people, death is even one of them. Not that's, maybe specific to antidepressants, but you see it on TV all the time. It's like, we just have normalized death potential.
Yeah, but there are some very common, more than half of people will experience sexual dysfunction on antidepressants. Trouble with desire, arousal, ejaculation, orgasm in both sexes. Weight gain is common. Emotional numbing is very common. It's probably the way the drugs really work. I'll get to that in a second. Cognitive impairment, memory and concentration problems that I had very much. Nausea. There's a very wide variety of things, and in older people, and I guess most of the research is over 65. So at 55, they're not quite there yet, but it does seem to increase the risk of strokes and falls and bleeding as you get older.
Wow.
So it might be a reason to stay, to get off the drugs when you're a bit younger. 3, how do the drugs work? So I think that's really important, because if you're sort of told a drug fixes a chemical imbalance, it sounds very natural, safe, and sensible. If someone says to me, you don't have enough thyroid hormone, take some thyroid hormone, that sounds quite sensible to me. That's sort of a plausible thing. But if I don't have a serotonin problem, then actually this drug is actually making the chemistry in my brain abnormal. It's increasing serotonin in a not normal way. How do the drugs work? In surveys of patients on antidepressants, 3/4 of people say they feel emotionally numbed. That means that their normal range of emotions from very positive to very negative gets squashed into the middle. And if you're very anxious or very depressed, having the volume turned down from a 10 to a 3 can be a big relief. But it's not the same thing as fixing the underlying chemical problem. It is actually disrupting the normal functioning of your brain in order to numb things. And I think that's a very different explanation. It could be helpful. I'm not saying it's not helpful, but it's a very different explanation to fixing a chemical imbalance. You might be thinking, if it acts like that, I might want to be on it for not that long a period of time,
Right.
because it's actually the number one reason people come to my clinic in London. They say, I don't know what I think about my spouse anymore. I'm not sure if I bonded with my children properly. I used to like music and now I have no, because they've lost their emotional range. So there can be significant long-term consequences to emotional numbing. And so I think that's worth keeping in mind, that that's the probable way that these drugs work.
Yeah. And so tell us what Outro is, and what was inspiration behind creating Outro?
So, I mentioned the trouble I had coming off my drugs. That was the single most distressing experience of my life. It's the closest I've come to thinking I can't keep going like this. I spent then years traveling around giving lectures and writing papers about how to take people off antidepressants. And most doctors ignored me. They said it's too much trouble. People need to keep taking these drugs. And so eventually I was approached by people that are good at setting up clinics. And I said, well, I want to set up something that will allow people to avoid the trouble that I had coming off these drugs. And so it offers this very much more slower, careful, long-term tapering with enough support so that people are not ripped off these drugs. And it's done in a way that minimizes withdrawal effects. There's trained nurse practitioners who oversee what's going on. They prescribe small doses, because one of the tricks of coming off these drugs is people need to go down to these very small doses before stopping.
Like a
Much
microdose.
smaller. Yes, basically almost like microdosing. Not quite the same as in psychedelics, but yes,
People
getting down to
understand microdosing these days.
Yes. I guess that word's become a bit more popular. And I guess it comes down to the fact that even the smallest tablet or capsule of an antidepressant has a very large effect on the brain. And so research that I've done and others suggests you need to go down to extremely small doses before stopping, so you don't get into major trouble in coming down. And that approach is called hyperbolic tapering.
So you created the hyperbolic tapering. How did you figure out the right amount to decrease the dose by? And what does that look like for a client? So if they sign up, is there a
Yeah.
certain timeline? How long does this process take?
Yes. So I want to say, it's actually, I should kind of give attribution. A lot of people worked out hyperbolic tapering a little bit themselves through trial and error over the years. People, necessity is the mother of invention. A lot of people kind of work things out. And I learned a lot from other patients. And I put together some science, which we've now applied in Outro. So what I'm going to show you is the way that antidepressants affect the brain, especially what they do at low doses. So I'm going to show you, this is the important one. This is a very common antidepressant in America. It's called Celexa, or known as citalopram. And the major thing about this graph is this is dose on the bottom axis. This is effect on the brain on the y-axis. The main thing is it's not a straight line. So when you double the dose from 20 milligrams, a very common dose, to 40 milligrams, the highest dose, you don't increase the effect on the brain that much.
Right.
And 10 or 20 milligrams are the smallest tablets available in America. But even a tiny little dose like 2 milligrams actually has about half the effect of 40 milligrams.
Wow.
And so to get off the drug safely, what a lot of doctors do is they don't do it in the most sensible way. They say, well, go from 20 to 15 to 10 to 5 to 0.
That's what I've heard.
And what that means is the first reduction is not too bad. Next one's twice as hard. Third one harder again, and the fourth one,
that's where the big jump is.
Exactly. It's like jumping off a cliff.
Yeah.
That's when people end up in pieces. That's what happened to me. It's what happens to lots of patients. Yeah. Yes. Almost everybody I encounter, and the doctor says that can't be because it's such a small dose. But what they're getting confused by is it's a small, like half of a tablet, but it's a big dose in terms of the effect on the brain. That's what gets people into trouble. So what makes more sense, and this is sort of now hyperbolic tapering, apologies for the complexity, is you go down by even amounts of effect on the brain, and that corresponds to smaller and smaller reductions in dose down to these very small final doses. So imagine making it simple. Imagine walking down at this path. It's easy at the beginning. You can run along it. It gets steeper and steeper. You got to go inch by inch. So as you get down to lower doses, you got to go down by smaller and smaller amounts. And the way to sort of summarize that.
Thank you. I actually think that that
Sorry.
was a really helpful visual.
So-
So when people sign up for Outro, do you take over their prescription and they then get the prescription through you and you guys then dose it according to like that chart to help
Ex-
people taper off over time? And what is how long is that process, like that chart that you just
yeah,
showed?
yes. So exactly, we take over the prescribing. We you need non-standard formulations of the drug, which means often making a liquid or a capsule from a specialist pharmacy. And the time taken, it's a bit, how long is a piece of string? Everyone's a bit different. There are different risk factors. If you've been using a drug for 30 years that's very hard to come off, like Effexor, it can take people a year, 2 years, or longer to come off at a tolerable rate. Some people who use it for shorter, it can take just a few months.
Oh,
So we're
wow.
doing a lot of work with adjusting the rate to see what suits somebody.
I still think a
Because
year sounds pretty quick
yeah,
considering that people have been on this for, most, you said what the average is 8 years, right? That's a long
Exactly.
time.
Yeah. So some people sort of, when they first hear that, sort of their jaws drop open. They think they'll be off in a few weeks because they've been told that by their doctors. As we go through the process and they see what it feels like to go down, they sort of learn that it's not as easy as they thought it would be. We do a lot of adjusting, so it's very bespoke. We might reduce the dose by 10%, see how they feel for a month. That was
Mhm.
okay. Go a bit quicker. Wasn't too good. Go a bit slower. So there's a lot of kind of. It's not a
And
one size
personalize
fits
it, which
all.
is great too. I think that
Yes.
that's key. Like, we're all different. The way people metabolize different medications, some people might be fast metabolizers, slower metabolizers. I'm sure that definitely plays a part in terms of how people can get off the meds, either slower versus faster.
Completely. There's some sort of recognized risk factors. The longer you're on the drug, the harder it is to come off. Certain antidepressants are higher risk, but you're right, it's very individual, and so we're very sort of flexible. Some doctors sort of will give you, here are the 3, 4 doses, come back in 6 months. The process is not that easy. It needs a lot of monitoring to do it well.
And what's nice, what I love about all these newer telehealth things that have come online is that you actually have so much more communication with a practitioner and a doctor than you would your typical doctor because you have access to communicate versus
Yes.
just waiting for your next appointment.
Yes. So I think that makes a big difference. We have, what do they call asynchronous messaging? So you can message someone if things go wrong. Exactly. We don't want to hear about it in 4 weeks. We want to hear
Right.
about it that day. We can intervene. You might need to go back up a dose, pause. We don't want to let things get out of, hand. That's where things go wrong. So you're exactly right. I think that's a very key part. That's one of the, a bit of the special sauce to catch things before they get out of hand.
Yeah, I love that. And also on the well job, we love to sift through the noise. I wanted to bring up that there was a recently published article in The Conversation about a review that downplayed how antidepressant withdrawal symptoms worked. What was your take and what were the misses of that published article?
Yeah. So it kind of brings up the point that I brought up earlier about how short-term studies underestimate the risk for long-term users. So it was sort of like it was a sort of very fancy new, it's what's called a meta-analysis where they get all studies together. But actually they just got all the old studies and repackaged them. So it was a little bit of a, the slightly glib saying is garbage in, garbage out.
Yes.
They looked at 8 to 12 week studies. They used the latest techniques. And of course, they found that symptoms are generally mild and not so bad. And I think that's probably true. If you use an antidepressant for 8 or 12 weeks, I don't think withdrawal is very bad for most people. There's the exception. But again, that's kind of irrelevant if you've been on the drugs for years or decades. So, we don't get people at Outro generally who've been on the drugs for 8 weeks. I don't
Right.
think anybody's like that. A lot of people we're seeing, they've been on them for more than 2 years, more than 5 years, or more than 10 years. And
That's who
so,
you're focused on helping, and that
exactly. And
those are the
so,
people that need help. I mean, I get people all
exactly.
the time who say, maybe they went through a divorce or if they had anxiety and they wanna get off the meds, they just keep taking it. They don't even know why they're taking it anymore, but there is no path for them to get off it, and they are scared. So I love that Altria, what helps to remove that fear. You're fully supported
Yes.
and you're fully guided and you have the constant communication to help you get off. And I think the best message is that the drugs were never created and intended to be used for years on end. I think
Yes.
that's the biggest
Uh,
message.
So actually, I might just double down on that point, talk about divorce, etc. You know, um, most people are prescribed an antidepressant at the lowest, low point in their life. We know divorce, job loss, physical illness, moving cities, all that sort of thing. And this idea that if you stop the drug, the condition will come back. But I think for a lot of people that doesn't really make sense. They talk about a relapse, a return of your underlying condition, but you cannot have a relapse of divorce.
Right.
You can't have a relapse, of losing your job again. I mean, you can. Some people marry the same person twice because that's what they do. But so I really think there's been this very much over medicalization of low mood, despair, as a mental illness that means it'll be lifelong. Because if you get, I just say by people's mid 40s, 70% of us will meet criteria for clinical depression or anxiety. In other words, it's most of us.
It's midlife. It's a drop
that's-
in our hormones, especially for women. I mean, when estrogen goes down, that is a direct correlation to your brain.
Yes.
And
yes.
I'm hoping now that the Women's Health Initiative got debunked, it was an initiative from 2002. They just debunked it. It wasn't a good study. That now maybe people, instead of taking a medication first, they'll think of, oh, I actually might need some hormones to support my brain first and see if that helps. And then if that doesn't help, fine, then look at that second layer of maybe the medication could be something to, sort of, they're all Band-Aids at the end of the day. But I think people forget that a Band-Aid's not meant to be stuck on forever. That eventually you should heal and you take the Band-Aid off.
Yeah. I guess, yes, it's a good point. There's lots of causes of people being depressed, but I guess the point I'm trying to make is it's quite normal to have a low period in your life of anxiety or depression. Sorry, I meant up from birth to the age of 45. I don't mean in their mid. Yeah. It's quite, when people break up with their partners, when they, that makes people upset. I think in America especially, it's been framed as that's very abnormal. If you're upset for a few weeks, that's abnormal and needs treatment. The research shows that most people after a few weeks or a few months with no treatment at all feel better, just because you get used to the breakup. You go through a period of grief. You find a new job. You
ride the wave, basically.
Exactly. So I do think that there's been an incredible medicalization of emotions in America, which has led to all this prescribing. And then the other trick is when people come off their medications, like me, they can experience withdrawal effects that they mistake for their condition coming back. So, for example, if I hadn't known about withdrawal, I might have thought, look, I'm panicking, I feel terrible, I can't sleep. Maybe I need this drug because without it, I'm in this terrible state. So the withdrawal effects are often mistaken for someone's depression or anxiety coming back. A little bit like if you quit smoking, you feel anxious and irritable. It doesn't mean that you need to keep smoking to stay well. It just means you need to quit more carefully. And so that's a big mistake people make, is mistaking withdrawal effects for actually them without the drug rather than them coming off the drug, if you can see the difference.
Yes, that makes sense. They probably feel like they need it. And for somehow, like mindfulness, nutrition, movement, sleep hygiene, like all these other non-drug mental wellness practices have kind of just been left out of the conversation. It just feels like people feel, oh, there's a pill, pop a pill, and like all of it goes away. But I love the 5 questions that you provided, that we really need to take a minute, take a pause, have the meeting, get the information, and come prepared to that meeting to ask questions yourself too. Like, don't just get fed the information. We're so much smarter now. We have access to so many things. If you want, chat GPT it. We'll put the questions in the show notes. Come prepared with questions. And you got to protect yourself, because no one's going to protect yourself better than yourself, right? And
Yes.
we need to start using our brains a little bit more instead of just outsourcing, because it is hard that the data is so conflicting out there. And it is really confusing as a consumer to sort of sift through that noise. But people like you and Outro, I mean, it's really shifting the narrative and giving people a place and a solution for their future selves.
Yes. Actually, I'll just talk about that, because you're talking about alternatives to medication now. Actually, the data is much clearer than you would think. So in the UK, we're a bit different to the US. We have a government department that looks at effective treatments for depression. It's not exactly the same in America. You have sort of the psychiatry college who have more conflicts of interest than the government does.
Yeah.
And they say that there are 19 equally effective and cost-effective treatments for depression as antidepressants. And they include some of
19?
the things that you've talked about:
Wow.
mindfulness, different forms of therapy. They actually don't look at nutrition and sleep hygiene. They do look at exercise. And they find that they're all equally effective to antidepressants. Of course, they're all much more safe than antidepressants. And there are even studies that show that in the long term, things like mindfulness and therapy and exercise actually have a bigger effect than antidepressants because drugs wear off over time. That's what tolerance is.
Right.
But a skill like mindfulness, therapy is really about understanding yourself and others so you can more skillfully navigate through the system. That's something you can improve over time. There hasn't been enough research in nutrition and sleep hygiene, but of course it makes sense. How could you feel well without the basics being covered? And so, I think that once you understand that antidepressants are not that effective and they're not fixing a chemical imbalance, then it makes, because doctors sort of would go, oh, it's all laughable, all that hippie stuff,
Yes,
it's
they
not
really
real.
downplay it. I mean,
You
I
know,
am like living proof just for my own journey with Crohn's disease. I
right?
heal myself through food and have kept myself healthy for over 30 years through creating a wellness lifestyle. And a lot of people, they just don't want to do the work. They feel like, oh, it's too much work. But no, like if it's just the way that you live, right? If you're exercising, if you're being mindful, and what I can't even believe there's 19 things. I can't wait to go
Exactly,
look that
exactly,
up.
exactly. I'll
But
send it
if
first.
you even just choose 3 to 5 of them, I'm sure that that would make a huge difference. And then maybe over time, once you got those down and those feel like they're just part of you, it doesn't feel like work, then you can keep adding to it in time. And to me,
Yes.
that sets you free. It sets you free from appointments, this and that. Like it's just you're living your life and feeling great. Like there's no better gift to yourself than that.
Yes. I think the other side of the equation is, of course, one of the things that influences people's decision making is they go, well, I've got to do all these things, yoga and mindfulness. Oh my goodness, but there's this tablet I can just take and it's solved. I think a few things to understand about that sort of quick fix is, it's not a long-term fix. People they tend to wear off. They tend to cause all sorts of troubles that I've just talked about in the long term. Mindfulness doesn't cause concentration impairment, sexual
Mhm.
problems, trouble with sleep. That's number one. You know, and look, these are chemicals, and chemicals always have some kind of consequence. There's no free lunch with these things. Um, if you
And
take
our
something
body
short term, it
doesn't
doesn't matter.
recognize them too, right? They're not natural to our bodies.
Exactly,
So
they are
over
not natural. Exactly,
time,
they're not natural to our bodies. They are synthetic chemicals, and they change things. So to me, if you can do things with this natural movement diet, of course, it's preferable to using a drug, especially when you work out that drug is not all that effective in the first place.
oh, I think that's a perfect segment, Mark, to wrap up. What is one drop of wellness wisdom you like to leave with our listeners today?
Oh dear. I guess I'll just summarize maybe some of the things that I've said. Number one, feeling down, anxious, and low in mood, doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. Most of us respond like that to stresses in our life. It's quite normal. We've all been told that's an illness. I think that needs to be pushed back. Antidepressants, if they do something useful, it's by numbing your emotions. That might be useful in the short term, but can have long-term consequences. And if you stop an antidepressant and feel bad, it's not necessarily a sign you need the drug. It could be a sign you've come off too quickly, and coming off much more slowly down to very small doses, using things like compounded liquids, the sort of thing we do at Outro all the time, can let a lot more people come off their drugs. So I think a lot of people think they're trapped on their drugs because they've had trouble coming off. And it's one of the greatest pleasures in this area to see that people who thought they were trapped just needed to come off a lot more slowly.
Yeah,
And that's, really, really gratifying to see.
really. Thank you so much. Really, I'm probably thanking you for all the people who have been on their medication forever and now there's a path. I mean, I had so many clients. I'm so excited to send them your way. Where can people find you?
So Outro Health, is the telehealth clinic. It runs now in 7 states in America. There's a website online. We'll tell you where it's operating. It's in New York, California, and a few other big states. I've got a little dinky website, markhorowitz.org. I'm on Twitter at Mark Horrow. Outro Health is everywhere: Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, where all the cool young kids are. You can see more about them there.
Great. We will put everything in the show notes for you guys. And thank you so much for being with us, Dr. Mark Horowitz. It's been a pleasure. And I'm really excited to share this episode with everybody.
Okay, lovely talking to you, Amber.